Welcome to the HC Insider Podcast, a podcast dedicated to the commodities sector and the people within it. I'm your host, Paul Chapman.
Today we're talking about the meat industry. Protein demand has continued to go up inexorably across the globe as population grows and more people reach the middle class, and the sector has become increasingly industrialized as a result. 70% of the cost of raising livestock is their nutrition, and 70% of that are the commodities like grains that go into it. What is the structure of the industry, and what are the major challenges it faces today, from rising feed prices, inflation, disease, and a changing and shifting political landscape? Our guest is Chris Chavis. Chris leads performance solutions for animal nutrition at DSM, a global health and nutrition company. Chris has had a career in leadership across animal nutrition and agriculture. Please do leave a positive review or give us 5 stars on the platform you're listening on. It really helps to grow the audience and thus support the show. And as always, I hope you enjoy the episode. Okay, Chris, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Paul. I'm so happy to be here.
I'm excited to have the conversation. We're talking about essentially the meat industry, which is half an agricultural industry and half an industrial industry, but it faces many challenges as well as continuing growing demand globally for those proteins. Before we talk about sort of the opportunities and the challenges that face the industry, can you just get us all on the same page? I appreciate it's probably quite a new industry to talk about for some of our audience. So can you just help us understand, what we mean by the meat industry and roughly speaking, the broad market structure?
Well, the animal protein industry is varied as the species that comprise it. From chickens to pigs to sheep to beef, dairy cattle, there are quite a few differences within and among the species. And all these species will find many generational family farms, as well as farms that have grown in scale and through consolidation. There's a gross oversimplification would be that the smaller the animal, the more vertically integrated the industry has become, meaning broiler chickens and layers would be vastly more consolidated than beef or the dairy industry. Some call it industrialization, yet I would prefer the term more professionalization, as the scale has allowed investments in research into optimal health and nutrition, allowing most of us as consumers to be able to purchase affordable, high-quality animal proteins.
There's no easy way to define this industry because it is that half agriculture and half, industrial processing. Can you just, roughly speaking, in the Western world, industrialized world, how does meat get to our table, irrespective of whether it's swine, poultry, or beef?
In general, the same process is followed for all of those species, right? So the animal producer would be procuring grain, or actually the feed mill that they're buying their feed from would procure the grain, formulating that into diets, feeding the animals through the various life stages. In some cases, they may own the animal from birth to harvest. In other cases, they may specialize in a particular life stage, such as raising nursery pigs and then selling them and transferring ownership somewhere else. But in the end, then they're then harvested at the packing plant and then sold to retail.
Thanks for that. Can you give us, I guess, the setup of the animal nutrition world, which is at the heart of the story we're telling today, and how that is set up? Are these meat packers vertically integrated? What goes into animal feed? I mean, that is a huge segment of this industry, and as I said at the start, is the significant component that goes into raising livestock.
Yeah, indeed. Let's start with the grain itself. So typically you would have grain farmers that are producing corn and soybeans, the two major commodities that go into animal feed diets. Then those are then sold to the grain traders or processed. So for example, the soybeans are then processed into the soybean meal and separated out the oil. That soybean meal would be a main source of protein in the animal diets. And then that would then get sold to feed producers. So what I'm setting up for you is there's quite a few different players or industries involved throughout this chain. And then the feed companies would then be providing that feed to the animal protein providers or the animal protein producers for the most part. In some cases, in some highly consolidated companies, they may have their own feed mill where they're procuring the grain directly, as well as it's not just the grain, but of course, minerals, vitamins, and feed additives that go in to make that healthy diet for the animals. And then, of course, as we've already talked about a bit, is then once those animals reach their end weight, then they would be sold to the packing companies and where they would be harvested and then broken down into retail packaging.
A great description of roughly the supply chain, but we've, as a firm, HC, have worked in the animal nutrition space for quite some time, the last decade. This is an enormous industry, right? The scale of this is enormous. And those vitamins, all of those other additives that go in, that's also another entire, some of that's a commodity market, some of that's a specialty chemical market. Can you just set us up with some sense of scale about how all that comes together to feed what is, just an enormous industry?
Well, it is. It's an enormous industry and it's growing because the population continues to grow, especially when you look at the population growth and the emergence of more middle class. And so that's one of the main drivers why there's so much growth in the industry. And so when you think about meat overall, so you have the animals, so you're starting with the genetics, and then you would have the feed. Of the feed, about 70% of that cost is in the commodities, whether it's corn for an energy source or the soybean meal for the protein source. And then you would have the vitamins that would come in and other specialty feed additives. So it's quite sophisticated relative to all the inputs that go into animal production. And then of course there's all in the animal health industry as well that would be an important part of raising animals for protein.
Yeah, and we sort of had this trend over the last few years of animal health businesses getting into animal nutrition and vice versa, as those two things, as what's going on in human health, right? Those two things are intimately linked.
Yeah, for sure, because in my mind, health is really a consequence of the nutrition. And so this intersection between nutrition and health is getting ever closer than it ever has been.
And does one company, just generally speaking, if DSM and your various competitors, you're producing the full mix of all of those additives and vitamins, or is that industry fragmented as well?
So there are companies that produce amino acids. We are not one of them, but there's a number of players that would produce synthetic amino acids with part of an important part of the diet to ensure that the animals are getting the protein that they need. DSM's history has largely been in the vitamins, and we've been adding more and more specialty feed additives as we continue to look at how we can influence the animal's health through nutrition. And so that is an area that is growing, and that is growing largely because there's been a shift in animal health away from antibiotics and some of the traditional health products from a pharmaceutical to more of getting health through nutrition.
Yeah, and it's that amino acid section which is the sort of the commodity end of these of or the animal nutrition piece, right? And and like commodities, it follows a boom bust cycle and so forth, which is probably a separate story, but a fascinating.
Indeed, and vitamins as well. Vitamins, has a bit of a roller coaster. There's some volatility associated with that, and due to a lot of the drivers behind manufacturing of those products. Where most of the companies are looking into the future is as animal producers look to more precision, they look to fine tune operations from a sustainability standpoint. They look at how they can increase their efficiency and overall health of the animal through nutrition. That's where a lot of the research and innovation is geared to, where it's a sustainability standpoint or more precision in those animal diets.
One question, it might sound this might be a bizarre question, but how much of a difference does it make? I mean, getting that, working on getting the ever better nutrition for livestock. I mean, how much does it accelerate growth or the quality of the meat? I mean, what's the goals here?
Well, every morsel that the animal consumes has a cost with it. And producing animals and producing animal protein, 70% of that cost is in the diet. And so it has a significant impact on a producer's overall profitability. So you want to be able to ensure that the diets provide the nutrients and provide everything that's needed for the animal to basically to grow and to thrive. And then we get to a harvest weight that has the least amount of extra ingredients. And so we're looking for how do you optimize the diets in a way that an animal can reach harvest weight most efficiently. And so, with 70% of your cost of production tied up into the diet, it's a tremendous cost. And so, the more that you can be more efficient with the animals in terms of putting things in the diet where, for example, a mycotoxin binder. Mycotoxins are an increasing issue because of climate change. And so as the more and more, climate volatility, more hot weather, more periods of rain, those conditions are conducive to mycotoxin growth. And so mycotoxin can have a pretty significant impact on the diet if they're consumed in the grain. And so they cause the animals to be more inefficient, they can cause health issues. And so that is a cost. And so these are the kind of things that we're looking at. Okay, how can you ensure that you're influencing the overall productivity of the animal through health and nutrition?
You mentioned there efficiency, and that is a big driver alongside actually sustainability, because the animal husbandry industry consumes a lot of land and a producer of greenhouse gases, and there's a lot of pressure from that direction as well, right, to make the industry more efficient, and even, as you know, in our discussions, be able to lower greenhouse gas emissions and so forth through nutrition.
Yeah, so just to, be clear, so a lot of the land use obviously is in the crops that go into the animal diets. And so we are producing more crops than we ever have from in terms of productivity if you look at yields in corn and soybeans. But indeed, you're right that most of that land usage for those crops does go into animal diets. And so we're always again looking at efficiency and how you're turning and upcycling protein from plants is critical. Efficiency and how we think about it from a sustainability standpoint, think about it more in terms of okay, if we can ensure that every egg that gets laid by a laying hen is able to reach the consumer shelf, or every animal that is born thrives and reaches harvest weight at in a healthy way, in a health, and we don't have losses and early piglet death and things like that along the way. So all of that has a cost to the producer and has an impact on the environment, especially if they've consumed grains and then that's not a protein source in the end. So looking at emissions, for example, the estimate is that the animal agriculture industry accounts for about 14% of the greenhouse gas emissions. So it is an area that has a lot of focus. And we actually at DSM have developed a product called Bovaer, which reduces methane emissions from cattle. And so this is one of the areas that we're looking to reduce overall animal emissions, but it's not the only one because there are other things that you can do as well. And things as simple as incorporating enzymes into the diets. Because if you think of the ingredients that are in corn, for example, energy, or in soybean meal from a protein source, not always are those ingredients bioavailable to the animal. So in some cases, you may have to incorporate an enzyme into the diet to ensure that it's broken apart and fully digested by the animal. So this is very sophisticated science, and the overall the nutrition in terms of thinking out how do you optimize diets, and it's also is relevant for us as well. And thinking of human nutrition as well. These are some of the ways, though, as you can look at how can I improve productivity through lifetime performance of an animal, such as how can a sow remain in the breeding herd longer than she might otherwise? How can we reduce egg breakage? How can we ensure that there's more pigs per sow per year, or that we have less mortality in the production? So all of these things impact the overall sustainability footprint of the industry.
It also strikes me as you're talking, you've kind of also got this challenge that chemicals company around the world have, where some of your product is a commodity, and other of your products are these specialty chemicals that require roles that we've done for years that are very, technical sales roles, vets who are now going in to talk to big clients about applications for these nutritional products. I mean, it's no mean business to pull off, to be able to actually combine those two together and get them sold in the right channels, right? I don't know if you can talk to that a minute.
Yeah, well, one of the biggest challenges for the industry is that the average consumer is very far away from production, meaning how many generations has it been since your family has had to produce food on the farm? Right? So, it's very, very remote now in terms of people being close to animal production. And so there's less and less understanding of how food is actually produced. Go ask your neighborhood kindergartner, where does the food come from? And what's the answer going to be? Well, it comes from the grocery store, right? But then, okay, where does the grocery store get the food? I don't know. It's just in the grocery store. And so just a understanding of food production and agricultural systems is very, very limited these days. And I think that's one of the challenges in front of the industry. Also, what that translates to is there's fewer and fewer people that are going into these areas. And sometimes some of the most sought after positions for people looking for talent, and maybe you know this with HC Insider, is that we're looking for people with a lot of poultry expertise. Poultry veterinarians in particular are one of the most sought after degrees that we're looking for to help support and help with the research and understanding of how we can continue to be more advanced and innovative as we're looking at overall efficiency.
And the other thing to say is a lot of those positions are in country, right? So actually, we've done heads of technical sales for poultry, with exactly that background you're looking for across Latin America, and incredibly hard to find. And as you say, like, this is a challenge that the commodity industry faces more broadly, right? As people get further away from sort of the, how these things are produced. And then you've got all of and there's some similarities between the oil industry, right? There's a lot of misperception out there in the public, a lot of, a lot of easy bashing, dare I say it, of various industries, that you aren't able to attract young talent, let alone, to get these people into the industry.
Yeah, indeed. There's so much misinformation out there. And we've been saying for a long time in the industry that how important it is to tell our story. And I think we don't always do a good job of that and taking the opportunity. There's much more of an initiative to do so. But educating efforts, are really, really important for the industry, because it's important to understand where food is grown, how food is grown, and there's so much misinformation out there. And animal protein is widely recognized as an important source of protein and health
Yeah.
for humans. And so being able to do it in a way that is sustainable and is right for the animals as well is very important.
And emblematic of that, before we move on to I guess, the meat of the show, gosh, 20 minutes in, is bad pun, if you're at least in the US, if you go and buy chicken in the supermarket, on that packet says no hormones added ever. And, you think, oh, you're buying some, decent chicken or whatever it might be. But the point is, hormones aren't used in the poultry industry, right? At least I was told by someone at a dinner once. And it's just a classic case of a combination of misinformation and then, sort of having to address these public concerns, the things that actually aren't real in the first place.
Yeah, there's a lot of information right now that you can find on the food packaging within the grocery store shelves, not only on meat, but everything else. And it's got to be so overwhelming and confusing for consumers. At the end of the day, there's a consumer desire for more information, and there's a concern and a fear. And marketing is trying to address the needs, but often they're not part of reality as it relates to, in this example, your hormones in chickens, because there are no hormones fed to chickens. And so it's just, it's an area where, again, a lot of distance between consumers today and their understanding of actual animal protein production.
It's interesting because, that that can be construed as marketing, but it's necessary marketing to address what is a public concern, that it's now become expected by the public, because when you don't have no hormones added on your organic chicken, they're going to start to worry. So it's a bit of a vicious cycle there.
Yeah, indeed. And I think this is one of the challenges the industry will have going forward is there's more and more demands and regulatory constraints imposed upon the industry from consumers or regulatory bodies, and it's not necessarily grounded in science.
Right. Okay. So the reason why we are all becoming more aware of meat, and as President Joe Biden said the other day, Americans are getting used to the phrase supply chains, is, of course, since the pandemic, we've had what effectively is becoming a global energy crisis, which is translating into food. And you mentioned earlier that 70% of the cost of the meat comes from the nutrition, and 70% of the cost of that comes from the grains and soybean meal that go into it. Can you just, what is going on right now? We are seeing inflation in prices. Have I identified the right cause of that? And what do you see as a result? I mean, how are markets responding? Is demand still increasing?
We do see demand still increasing, but if you look at it from a global perspective, it's shifting quite a bit. So we see meat consumption declining in the West, but it's increasing everywhere else, especially in Asia and the Middle East, as the per capita wealth increases, or you get more of that middle class growing. But what's happening right now, is really, volatility, in one word, volatility. But we've been talking about it in terms of a couple of C's or 3 to 5 C's, depending, and those C's being climate, conflict, of course, with what's going on with the Ukraine, currencies, and of course, COVID impacting consumption. It's a very unprecedented time for the industry because there's so many of these variables that are affecting the industry. And disease has also been relevant as well, because we've had African swine fever in China that has reduced dramatically the number of sows. And so the country has rebuilt the sow herd in the last 2 years. And then, of course, avian influenza is also an issue impacting producers on a number of different continents as well. And so that keeps bird supplies down as well. But the trade wars and the geopolitical tension is a big one, especially considering how much grain comes out of Russia and the Ukraine. And so that's shifting a lot. It's also causing a lot of the producers to think about alternatives. So are there other alternative grains that I can use? And thinking about how to minimize the risk.
Parking disease and I guess politics and geopolitics, which are the other two big categories I want to cover, staying on just the price side alone. I mean, we've had 10 years, dare I say it, or at least 8 years of low, stable prices in grains, much to the chagrin of a number of trading houses. But have all of these large meat producers, they haven't been hedging, or they've just gotten comfortable and used to the fact that actually you've had these low prices. And this same thing is going on, I think, industry worldwide, where various industries have kind of forgotten the volatility in their commodity feedstocks, be it plastics, whatever it might be. Are they just passing those costs on to consumers? Are some of them hedged? Do you have any sense of kind of how painful it is right now for the meat sector?
Oh, it's super painful. It is super painful. A few months ago, we were looking at the break evens from swine production, and really there was only one part in the world that looked like it was actually making money. China, for example, has been a bit of a perfect storm because they had increased, because of African swine fever, their sow herd to have more pork production, more pork available on the market. When they encountered that disease, their broiler industry had expanded. So then there was more chicken meat on the market. And then with COVID and the lockdowns, now all of a sudden there was a glut of protein on the market, consumers unable to buy it and to consume it for a lot of the issues associated with COVID. Then you had swine producers completely losing money every single month. And so it's been a very, very tough period of time, especially in swine. And what we see is that if you take the US, for example, the costs have gone up. Certainly for the consumer, you're probably facing that when you walk into the local grocery store and look into the meat counter. But it does seem like there's a lagging effect by the time that it actually trickles back to the producer. So it's a very, very tough time. And so margins are squeezed. Unbelievably so, producers are making difficult choices, many of them cutting out feed additives, some of them even reducing vitamin levels, which is definitely not the most optimum thing to do from a productivity standpoint. But in some cases, it's been very, very difficult for them to stay in business.
The HC Insider podcast is brought to you by HC Group, a retained search, intelligence and advisory firm focused solely on the global energy and commodity sector. With 6 locations across Asia, Europe and the Americas and over 50 consultants. To find out more, go to our website, hcgroup.global. There, you can also sign up for our HC Insider content for more interviews and white papers on relevant trends and talent impacts in the commodities world.
It's quite an inelastic business, market as well, right? People are still consuming meat, irrespective of these quite significant price rises.
They are, but they will switch. So the industry that will suffer the most will be the beef cattle industry. So you may, instead of choosing that ribeye steak for dinner, it may be chicken breasts or chicken wings, or you may be downgrading or eggs. And so what we'll see is that chickens will typically be the winner when there's more pressure on consumers and their ability to spend. And so so you see that shifting amongst the protein sources. Egg consumption tends to increase during times of inflation. So this is probably one of the most resilient markets, but it's also, I would say, one of the best available sources of protein. They're one of the healthiest things that you could eat as well. So we do expect the egg market to continue to increase modestly going forward. But again, it becomes a shift amongst the proteins.
This is probably going to be a long-term trend, right? I mean, the expectation with, and I do like those 5 Cs, the conflict's not ending anytime soon. We've still got sort of all of the challenges over COVID and disruption to supply chains going on. I mean, all of those 5 are still in a volatile state. So, the expectation is, you've also got other competition for those grains as well in the form of fuels, which is again a very different debate or a thorny one. But it doesn't seem like food prices are going to be going down anytime soon, with the suite of causes behind it still present and in some cases escalating.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I wouldn't expect food prices, and especially meat prices, to come down. I think that there will be, again, like I said, a shifting amongst the species. And so it's very cyclical, especially cattle numbers. And so maybe there'll be a reduction in cattle herd sizes as well. And so, we also, I think we see the trends to overall reducing meat consumption in the West. So that trend may accelerate a bit more, maybe not by choice, but because of economic pressures. So yeah, I think this trend is here to stay.
It'd be interesting to get your take, because one thing that hasn't seemed to take off, like all of the expectations in the pandemic at least, around alternative proteins. The meat industry is quite resilient, and people are continuing to choose and prefer that over alternative proteins, at least to date.
Alternative proteins have been growing double digit for a number of years until last year, where they slowed down. I'm certain that costs are a factor in this. Alternative meats are more expensive than animal protein, and consumers are super cost conscious right now. Certainly, there's another trend that's coming up as well, is sometimes these are also ultra processed. So we'll have to wait and see about how things look longer term. At the end of the day, there's a big demand for protein consumption, for proteins globally, and that demand will remain strong. So I'm pretty confident that these markets will be able to nicely coexist. People want choice, and I think the demand for protein will remain strong.
However, there's a lot of research and a lot of innovation still ongoing looking at alternative protein for animal diets. Alternative protein being in the form of single cell proteins produced from bacteria or from yeast or fungi, or even insects. And so those are still 2 areas that I think are quite hot and that could have an influence in the future in animal diets.
Also, again, in the news recently, with I think there's a massive cull going on in the UK over bird flu, is disease, and there's a couple of factors here that are making that much more critical, right? One is obviously the concentration within the industry, the scale of the industry means that any local outbreaks are much harder to control. And you saw that you've mentioned a couple of times the African swine fever in China, where, and I'd like you to get you to give us some sense of scale on that because it was just tremendous impact on the industry there. And the other, of course, is climate change, where pathogens are more easily spread in warming environments. You know, they've got a bigger geographical range, whatever it might be. So disease is obviously profoundly impacting on this sector and can have disastrous consequences. Can you just give us some sense of scale and what we're talking about here?
Yeah, well, let's start with the African swine fever one. And so that is such a devastating disease. And in China, when they had their outbreak of African swine fever,
They reduced their population by 45% of the sows.
and so it was absolutely devastating. And so this is something that is very, very concerning for the industry overall. And the US is on high alert to ensure that African swine fever doesn't reach the US borders. But I think a lot of people will say it's just a matter of time. It's not if, it's when. And you have things that like feral pigs that also make it difficult to control as well. So in Germany, there's some outbreaks of that, and they attribute some of that to feral pigs. And so being able to invest in health resilience is certainly very important, but something like African swine fever, the best way to control that is culling of the herds. From an avian influenza standpoint, they do the same thing, looking at culling sick, affected barns and affected complexes. Again, wild birds, the native birds to the area are also very difficult to control, obviously. And so that makes it even more challenging. One of the things that we see driving, or we think, could be a contributing is that, there's been antibiotic resistance, that has come up. And so one of the big legislative initiative in Europe and is that we no longer allow the use of antibiotics for growth promotion in animals. Obviously, if an animal is sick, then they're still treated. But looking at alternatives to antibiotics has been a huge driver, both from a legislative as well as a consumer standpoint. And this is leading to a lot of opportunities to see, okay, again, how do we come back to influencing health through nutrition? So this is an area of huge importance from a research standpoint, from a product standpoint, but looking at biosecurity overall is one of the probably top issues and something that's front of mind for most of the producers in the US, for example, is just ensuring that their biosecurity protocols are followed and are strict enough to manage and to mitigate any disease.
Well, I also mentioned there, obviously, climate change. Is that having an impact on disease load, disease spread, disease where these diseases are endemic?
I believe climate change is having a big impact on animal production. Probably the most obvious area is in heat stress. It's maybe a bit more subtle, but heat stress is a big impact, in terms of animals being able to deal with the heat. You may have a lot of temperature volatility as well. So a lot of temperature swings. So it could be super hot one day, and then 2 days later, it's had a rapid drop in temperature. And so I think that also has an impact on animals, and I think us as well. But heat stress is where we see perhaps the most urgent impact on the animals. And then mycotoxins, I mentioned, that's something that we see more and more evidence of in the crop because of some of the volatility and in the weather patterns. Those mycotoxins can do everything from just overall reduce your efficiency of processing the feed to causing piglet mortality, to having an impact on the gestation of animals as well. So it can have a wide-ranging impact. Mycotoxins that can be fatal to horses as well. So there's a lot of different mycotoxins, more than 400. They can have different effects, reduce overall fertility, and so this is something that's in the grains. and that we see increasing. So, but heat stress in the near term is probably the biggest concern as a result of climate change.
The final area of real challenge, and I think we're setting up a picture that it is a tough time for the meat industry, is obviously politics and geopolitics, that conflict and just or at least a pause in globalization, arguably deglobalization that's going on. And of course, meat, which is so central to societal health and so forth, is front and center in some of those trade disputes that have, or outright protectionist regimes or whatever it might be. So it's that is also a very challenging route to navigate for meat producers and obviously, of course, the suppliers in the animal nutrition world that goes into that.
One of the challenges that is very difficult for the industry is that there's a lot of pressure coming from both governments, but also consumers. And as we talked about earlier, not necessarily informed consumers. And so, figuring out what are the right mandates to put on the industry that makes sense for the animals is, sometimes they're a bit at odds, but certainly the regulations are impacting many producers in different countries. So I think there's a couple that would be useful to keep an eye on. For example, in the Netherlands, they're not allowing dairymen to expand their herds. And in fact, they're paying for some farmers to go out of business, to stop producing, and because they're trying to reduce the impact that they believe is coming from agriculture. But this is going to have an impact around the total food available within the country. And so then there's also more and more pressure around scope 3 emissions. Okay, what are scope 3 emissions? And this would be from a retailer perspective. Retailers will measure scope 3 emissions, which are those emissions that result of activities from their suppliers. So in this case, the packing plants, who's then their suppliers, of course, would be the farmers or the dairy processor. And so there's just a lot more initiatives that are going to be impacting the industry. In some ways, in some places, there's also positive incentives. So like fast food chains like McDonald's and Burger King are setting emission targets, throughout their value chain. And we're thinking, and then we're seeing that there is some incentives in places for producers who can produce pork, for example, with a lower carbon footprint.
All of these are driving up costs, including obviously competition for those grains with the fuel industry, with biodiesel and renewable diesel and ethanol and so forth. It must be very challenging to navigate. And actually, one wonders if we see continued inflation, continued rising in prices for food, there's only so, you can't downshift from chickens that easily. Whether actually there will be the continued pressure to tackle sustainability as well.
Yeah, I hope that it remains central to animal producers' agendas. And I believe it is, because having an eye on sustainability means also ensuring that there's reduced waste, or we're improving overall performance of animals, and ensuring that we're getting the most out of the meat, milk, and egg production. And I think, there's certainly a lot of requirements from in the investment community as well. So for publicly traded companies, there's obligations, and there's a number of investor network, for example, like the FAIR Initiative, that monitors ESG, the environmental, social, and governance risk in the animal ag sector. And they're calling out companies that are doing well and companies that are not. The biggest challenge in the industry, though, is that there's not a consistent metric on how to measure sustainability footprint. And this is, if you're a farmer and you've got a number of cows or pigs or chickens, whatever it is, how do you measure your sustainability farm print? And this is going to be very important, because it can be very inconsistent from one farm to the next. And so having a very consistent science-based way to measure what really is the sustainability farm print is super important. It's an area that we branched into and started investing in, and came up with a tool called Sustel to utilize to actually measure it in a science-based way. because this is a need that we saw coming because there's so much impact. But again, how do you measure and how do you get a consistent measurement from one industry to the another, whether it's from dairy or to poultry, and then how do you make sure that it's science based?
Yeah, no, and that is, I think that's a really crucial point. And then actually you can start layering in those incentives, whether it's cheaper financing or it's carbon credits or whatever it is that actually rewards those farmers and makes it economically viable to push for sustainability, right? And I think there's a lot of rhetoric, but there isn't actually the tools and the standardization there yet to really push these goals. I think that's a very good point. Sort of putting the future hat on for a moment as we wrap up. You've mentioned some trends there, talking about alternative proteins into feeds and so forth, and this coupling of nutrition and health. What do you think are the major trends that you're looking at over the next decade, aside perhaps I think from sustainability, that is you see on the horizon for the industry?
Yeah, sustainability, as you mentioned, is going to be front and center for sure, and being able to measure that. Another area that I think is super important is around precision and precision farming and understanding how to be even more sophisticated and more precise in the production of animal protein, whether that's from a health perspective, whether it's from a nutrition perspective, being able to measure and maybe even customize feeding at some point. So the area of precision is an area that a lot of people are spending time looking at how to do individual animal management, how to
Mm,
understand and track when an animal, when immediately if an animal's not feeling well, then you can make an intervention earlier in the process. And so precision is something that I think will be very interesting area to keep an eye on. That's something I think has a lot of opportunity across the board, whether it's from a health perspective, genetics, it's just overall animal management and the opportunity to improve profitability overall. So precision, the precision space is super cool, and there's so many different technologies that are being tested on the market now, whether it's a wearable for an animal or a tracking device, like all sorts of things. But figuring out how to take that data and utilize it will be a challenge for a producer. So data won't be the problem, but getting the insights from the data will be much more of a challenge.
yeah.
The other area that I think is super cool, and I'm personally very fascinated with it, is this continuing focus on the microbiome. We now think of the microbiome, which is this collection of bugs that are living essentially in the GI tract of humans, animals. We think of the microbiome as a newly discovered organ in the animal. And a lot of the research is focused on this interaction between how can you influence the microbiome so it influences the animal in the way that is positive. So looking at how you can influence this microbiome and the metabolites that the bacteria in the gut produce, and then communicate with the body that can influence the animal's health or resilience or behavior, whether it's lean muscle accretion, less aggressive sow behavior, reproductive performance. It's fascinating how many different things we believe we can influence through the microbiome. So it's
Mm.
probably something to consider in the future as a whole nother podcast, because there's so much happening in the space of microbiome.
Yeah, I was going to say, because we've done a lot of work, the probiotic space and so forth, and it seems like almost in some sense the animal nutrition world is leading the human nutrition world in the understanding of the overall body effects and actually how chemistries and behaviors and everything can change quite quickly as a result of altering that microbiome.
Yeah, indeed, because you can do so much research, and you can with pigs and with chickens, for example, versus humans. You can just do hundreds and hundreds and thousands of data points, and actually get real microbiome information collection, and so understanding how you can influence that. So I do think you're absolutely right about that. The animal world is probably leading on it from a human standpoint, and I think it's super cool. There's so much to do, but again, it's like, okay, you have all the data. We're trying to screen for different compounds and how the microbiome can be influenced and what does that do. But again, it's okay, we have a lot of data now. What are the insights that come out of it, and how do we actually use those in our decision making process?
I've really enjoyed the discussion. There's so many more questions I have and topics I want to dive into, but really appreciate your time, and hopefully we can have you on again in the future and see where the industry is.
Thank you, Paul. I really appreciate the opportunity to talk about this awesome industry with you.
Great stuff.
Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed this episode and want to support the show, please give us a positive review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify.
To find out more about HC Insider and HC Group, a search and advisory firm dedicated to the commodity markets, visit our website at www.hcgroup.global. There you can find out more about our services and our offices around the world. There you can also find more content, from interviews to insight pieces to more podcasts focused on the commodity value chains. Thanks again for listening.